On a hilltop in Massachusetts, there is a building where people now pay $2,500 a month in rent. They have granite countertops, a heated pool, an indoor basketball court. Beneath their feet, 770 bodies lie in unmarked graves. Numbers instead of names. Metal pipe markers instead of headstones. This is the story of Danvers State Hospital. But the story does not begin in 1878, when the first patient walked through the doors. It begins almost 2 centuries earlier in 1692, when the man who owned this same hill was signing death warrants during the Salem witch trials. Judge John Hathorne never apologized. He never expressed a single moment of remorse. And somehow, the land he left behind became the site of one of the most notorious mental institutions in American history. A place where patients were lobotomized, restrained, starved, and forgotten. A place so terrifying that it inspired H.P. Lovecraft's Arkham, which inspired Batman's Arkham Asylum, which means the most famous fictional madhouse in the world traces back to a real one, on a real hill, built on cursed ground. If you enjoy deep investigations into America's abandoned institutions and the dark histories they tried to bury, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which forgotten place to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. The building rises from the Massachusetts hilltop like something transported from another century, another world entirely. 128 rooms, a tower visible for miles, red brick and granite stretching a quarter-mile across the ridge with Gothic spires cutting into the New England sky. But to understand what this building became, and why its shadow still falls across American horror fiction 100 years later, you have to understand the ground it was built on. And that ground has been soaked in darkness since long before anyone ever laid a brick. The hill where Danvers State Hospital stands was not empty land when Massachusetts bought it. It carried a history that most people in the area would have preferred to forget. In 1637, a Puritan magistrate named William Hathorne received a 200-acre land grant in Salem Village that included the glacial drumlin that would later be called Hathorne Hill. He built a mansion on top of it, accumulated more than 1,000 acres through additional grants, and earned a reputation that followed his family for generations. He was known as a bitter persecutor of Quakers. He once ordered the public whipping of a woman named Anne Coleman in the streets of Salem. But William Hathorne was not the family member who left the deepest mark on this land. That distinction belongs to his son. Judge John Hathorne became the most aggressive figure in the Salem witch trials of 1692. As chief examiner during the pre-trial hearings, he personally conducted the initial interrogations of the accused, beginning on March 1, 1692, when he questioned Sarah Osborne, Tituba, and Sarah Good at the Salem Village Meeting House. His methods were deliberate and cruel. He asked harsh, leading questions designed to pressure confessions out of terrified people, many of them women, many of them elderly, none of them guilty of anything beyond being vulnerable. 20 people were executed. Unlike his fellow magistrate Samuel Sewell, who publicly apologized in 1697, Judge Hathorne never expressed remorse. Not once. He died in 1717 at the age of 76 and was buried at the Old Burying Point Cemetery in Salem, his conscience apparently undisturbed. Here's a detail that changes the way you hear the rest of this story. The town we now call Danvers was originally Salem Village itself, renamed in 1752. This was not a neighboring community. This was the actual epicenter of the witch hysteria. The trials did not happen in modern-day Salem. They happened here. Two of the chief accusers, Ann Putnam and her daughter, lived on land just below the slopes of Hathorne Hill. The foundations of Reverend Samuel Parris's parsonage, where the hysteria began with the so-called afflicted girls, still exist in Danvers. Rebecca Nurse's homestead, where the 71-year-old grandmother accused of witchcraft lived before she was hanged, stands nearby. The literary echo of this place traveled further than anyone could have predicted. Nathaniel Hawthorne, born Nathaniel Hathorne, was the great-great-grandson of Judge John. He added the W to his surname shortly after college, and most historians believe he did it to distance himself from his ancestors' legacy. He wrote that the family's persecuting spirit had left a stain upon them. Judge Hathorne appears as the antagonist Judge Pincheon in The House of the Seven Gables. The themes of inherited guilt, of sin passed down through bloodlines, of land that carries the memory of what was done on it, all of that traces directly back to this hill. The property passed through several families over the following centuries. The Ray family held it for 80 years. Then Nathaniel Brown, Eben Porter, James Prince, and finally, Francis Dodge. Dodge was a local farmer and Civil War veteran who worked the land quietly until November of 1873, when the Commonwealth of Massachusetts offered him $39,542 for his 197.25 acres. Dodge accepted. The state had just purchased the most haunted piece of real estate in New England, and they were about to build something enormous on top of it. Something designed with genuine optimism and remarkable ambition to heal the human mind. The fact that it would eventually do the opposite is the central tragedy of this story, and it starts with a Quaker doctor who believed that the right building, in the right place, could cure insanity. Thomas Story Kirkbride was born in 1809 in Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker, a physician, and for 43 years he served as superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. During those 4 decades, he developed an idea that would reshape American psychiatry and produce some of the most extraordinary buildings the country has ever seen. He stated it simply: architecture could cure mental illness, not medicine, not restraints, not punishment, but the building itself. Kirkbride believed that if you placed troubled minds in beautiful surroundings, gave them sunlight and fresh air, wide corridors and views of rolling countryside, the illness would recede. The patient would heal simply by living in a space designed to promote calm. In 1854, he published a book laying out every detail on the construction, organization, and general arrangements of hospitals for the insane. It became the Bible of asylum design in America, and its influence was enormous. The plan prescribed specific requirements. Hospitals had to be set on at least 100 acres in the countryside, far from the noise and chaos of cities. They could house a maximum of 250 patients, 200 preferred. They had to be arranged in a distinctive staggered layout, wings stepping back progressively from a central administration building, like a bat spreading its wings in flight. This was not decorative, it was functional. The echelon design ensured that every wing received sunlight and fresh air through both ends of its corridors. Male patients occupied one side, female patients the other. The most agitated patients were housed in the outermost wards, and as they improved, they would move inward, ward by ward, closer to the center. Recovery meant reaching the middle. Release meant walking out the front door. It was idealistic. It was humane. And in December of 1873, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts hired the most prominent architect in Boston to turn that vision into reality on Hathorne Hill. Nathaniel Jeremiah Bradley had designed over 500 buildings during his career. He was a founding member of the Boston Society of Architects and a former president of the Boston Water Board. Before drawing a single line for Danvers, he traveled to existing hospitals at Worcester, Poughkeepsie, Concord, Philadelphia, Trenton, and Morristown, studying what worked and what failed. He came back and designed a masterpiece. Construction began on May 1st, 1874. The contractor J.B. Dacey and Company of Boston arrived with over 200 men and 60 horses to begin grading the hilltop. The foundation was built from Cape Ann granite at a cost of $14,900. Above that rose a Victorian Gothic structure that locals almost immediately began calling the castle on the hill. Critics in the state legislature preferred a different name. They called it the Hospital Palace at Danvers, and they did not mean it as a compliment. The materials came from everywhere. Red Danvers brick manufactured locally, Rockport granite for the trim, Maine slate for the roofing sealed with copper flashing, spruce framing with clear pine interiors, etched and stained glass panels in the doors, pressed metal ceilings, marble mantels, elaborate plaster brackets. The building was not designed to look like an institution. It was designed to look like a place where you might actually want to live. The finished hospital measured 313,000 square feet. It stretched 1,100 feet in length, a full quarter-mile between its farthest points, making it one of the longest buildings in Massachusetts. The Central Administration Tower rose 130 feet into the sky. 8 patient wings radiated outward from the center, connected by small square towers and ending in octagonal entrance towers. Gothic spires lined the roofline, and beneath all of it ran an elaborate labyrinth of underground tunnels connecting every building on the property, which would eventually include more than 40 structures: medical buildings, dormitories, workshops, a chapel, staff cottages, and farm buildings. The total cost was $1.5 million. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $38 million. It significantly exceeded the original estimate of just over $1 million. The hospital was turned over from state commissioners to trustees on October 25, 1877. On May 13, 1878, the first patient walked through the doors. For a brief window, the building did exactly what Kirkbride imagined it would do. But that window was already closing before anyone realized it had opened. To understand how badly things went wrong at Danvers, you first have to understand how genuinely right they were at the beginning. The philosophy behind the hospital was called moral treatment, and it did not originate in America. It started in France, where a physician named Philippe Pinel physically removed the chains from patients at 2 Paris hospitals in the 1790s, an act so radical that his colleagues thought he had lost his own mind. It continued in England, where a Quaker named William Tuke founded the York Retreat in 1796, a facility that emphasized rural quiet, light labor, and minimal restraint. It arrived in America through Dorothea Lynde Dix, a reformer who spent years visiting jails and poorhouses across the country and found mentally ill people confined in cages, closets, cellars, and stalls, chained naked, beaten with rods. When Dix visited Massachusetts, she specifically described a woman in Danvers who was in the horrid process of tearing off her skin by inches. That report helped build the political will to construct the hospital. The first superintendent was Dr. Calvin S. May, appointed in January of 1878. He declared his goal clearly. This would be a hospital for the cure of patients, rather than an asylum for the chronic insane. And for a time, it actually was. The wards were open. Patients were rarely locked in. Physical restraints were refused entirely. Patients received private rooms with views of the manicured grounds. Fresh produce and meat came from the hospital's own farm. Occupational therapy included gardening, basket weaving, sewing, baseball, and outdoor exercise. The idea was simple: treat people like people, and they might start to recover. The hospital was designed to be completely self-sufficient. It had its own farm, its own power plant, its own water supply pumped from Middleton Pond, its own workshops, laundry, and kitchens. In just its second year of operation, the farm produced 50 cords of wood and over 10,000 pounds of fresh pork. By 1902, the hospital had purchased an additional 100 acres to expand farming operations. In its early decades, Danvers was genuinely innovative. In 1879, it became the first mental hospital in Massachusetts to hire a woman doctor. In 1889, it established a nursing training school, only the second in the state. In 1895, it founded a pathological research laboratory. By 1912, it had launched a community mental health program that became the model for what was called the Massachusetts Plan, where the state hospital served as the center of psychiatric activity for its entire district. Superintendent Dr. Charles Whitney Page, who led the hospital across 2 terms, declared mechanical restraint unnecessary and harmful, and successfully pushed the state legislature to pass an act forbidding patient restraint entirely. This was the promise: a hospital built on cursed ground that was somehow doing exactly what it was supposed to do, treating patients with dignity, innovating, healing. But the building had been designed for approximately 450 patients. With the attic infirmaries included, you could stretch that number to maybe 500 or 600 if you were generous with the definition of capacity. That number was not a guideline. It was the absolute ceiling of what Kirkbride's design could sustain before the philosophy collapsed. Fresh air, sunlight, private rooms, open wards, occupational therapy, all of it depended on having enough space and enough staff to maintain the conditions that made moral treatment possible. The cracks appeared almost immediately. By 1881, just 3 years after the first patient walked through the doors, the population had already reached 626. The 1885 annual report contained a warning that should have set off alarms across the state. Nobody listened. And what followed was one of the longest, slowest institutional catastrophes in American history. The numbers tell the story more clearly than anything else. In 1878, the hospital opened with a design capacity of roughly 450 patients. By 1881, 3 years in, there were already 626. By 1901, the number had surged to 1,137. By the 1920s, it was approaching 2,000. And in 1939, the daily population reached 2,360, with 278 patient deaths recorded that year, and nearly 1,000 new admissions arriving annually. Some sources suggest the count eventually climbed as high as 2,600 to 3,000 by the late 1960s, once all the campus facilities were included. Think about what that means in practical terms. A building designed with care and precision to house 450 people in private rooms with sunlight and fresh air was now holding 4 to 5 times that number. The corridors that Kirkbride had designed for recovery became holding pens. The rooms built for one person held 3, sometimes 4. Multiple forces drove this disaster, and none of them were accidental. Industrialization and immigration swelled urban populations, and demand for psychiatric care grew faster than anyone had planned for. The patients being admitted were increasingly from lower income groups, many of them immigrants. The eugenics movement, which had gained respectable standing in American science by the early 1900s, reframed mental illness as hereditary, something to be segregated out of the population rather than treated. Freudian psychiatry classified severe psychoses as incurable, which gave institutions permission to stop trying to cure anyone and focus instead on long-term storage. And state governments, facing the cost of actually building enough hospitals to handle the demand, made a simpler choice. They packed more bodies into the buildings they already had. Staff levels barely changed, while the patient population multiplied. At Danvers, the ratio may have reached 1 staff member for every 16 patients, or worse. The people hired to provide individualized care were now responsible for managing crowds. The consequences were exactly what you would expect. Patients slept in hallways and basements. They walked the wards naked because there were not enough clothes or enough staff to help them dress. They lived in their own filth because there was no one to clean them or the spaces they occupied. The straitjackets that early superintendents had proudly refused became everyday tools. The 1939 trustees' report references the use of special garments and bed care for denudative patients, which is institutional language for restraining people who had stripped themselves bare because no one was watching. The buildings that were meant to be expansive and give patients freedom were now stuffed with bodies, creating a downward spiral of deplorable conditions, understaffing, overtaxed resources, and cruelty that became routine. Because routine was the only thing holding the place together. One of the wings earned a nickname among patients and staff alike. They called it the snake pit. But the overcrowding did not just cause misery, it caused death. In 1934, a patient named Hugh Foy, 41 years old from Andover, died after eating sauce contaminated with insecticide. A dozen other patients fell violently ill from the same meal. An investigation found that 10 pounds of cockroach powder had gone missing from the hospital supply stores. Whether the contamination was intentional or the result of catastrophic negligence was never fully resolved. But the incident triggered a broader investigation. In 1938, State Auditor Thomas H. Buckley disclosed that 8 patients had been killed by fellow patients at Danvers and the nearby Medfield State Hospital in recent years. The resulting investigation uncovered something worse. Over the course of the hospital's history, 400 patients had died from causes other than natural causes. 400 people. That number sat in a government report. It was not a secret. It was simply something nobody wanted to look at too closely. The 1950s brought more. In 1952, a patient named Charles W. Baker was beaten to death by fellow patients. In 1953, patient Michael P. Coffey died the same way. That same year, a kitchen employee named Joseph E. Henrich died after a scuffle. And in 1955, the laundry superintendent, Leslie N. Jackman, was robbed and murdered by two young patients inside the facility. These were not rare breakdowns in an otherwise functional system. They were symptoms of a place that had fundamentally failed. A building designed to heal was now generating its own casualties, patient against patient, staff caught in the crossfire, and a bureaucracy that documented the deaths and then carried on as though documentation were the same thing as accountability. The 1939 trustees' report stated it with a plainness that borders on the absurd. This hospital, it read, has received nearly 1,000 new admissions per annum, which is altogether too large a load considering space, personnel, and the close attention that the newly admitted patient requires. The same institution had been issuing variations of this warning since 1885. Over half a century of saying the same thing, over half a century of being ignored. And into this chaos, American psychiatry introduced its most terrifying tools. The treatments that followed were not designed to heal. They were designed to control. And they would turn Danvers State Hospital from an overcrowded disaster into something that still haunts the people who study it. The first tool was water. Hydrotherapy arrived at Danvers as early as 1899. The theory behind it was that continuous warm baths, cold, wet sheet packs, and sitz baths could ameliorate what doctors at the time called the clogged condition of the brain. Patients were wrapped tightly in cold, soaking sheets and left for hours. Others were placed in tubs of warm water and kept there for days at a stretch, restrained so they could not climb out. Under Superintendent Dr. J.B. McDonald, who led the hospital from 1916 to 1927, 2 new hydrotherapy units were constructed specifically to expand the practice. The language used to describe these treatments in official reports was calm, clinical, measured. The experience of being wrapped in freezing sheets and unable to move was none of those things. The second tool was sugar, or rather, the absence of it. Insulin shock therapy was introduced at Danvers in 1946. The procedure involved injecting patients with increasing doses of insulin until their blood sugar dropped so severely that they fell into a hypoglycemic coma. The coma was the point. Doctors believed that shutting the brain down and restarting it might reset whatever had gone wrong. The risks were not theoretical: heart failure, brain hemorrhage, death. Patients who survived the treatment often came out confused, disoriented, and terrified. But the procedure continued because it produced docility. And docility was what an overcrowded institution needed more than anything else. The third tool was electricity. Electroconvulsive therapy arrived in the 1950s. In controlled settings with proper anesthesia and careful patient selection, electroconvulsive therapy can be a legitimate medical treatment. That is not how it was used at Danvers. At Danvers, electroshock was applied as behavioral control. Patients who were unruly, disruptive, or simply difficult to manage were subjected to the procedure as punishment. The effect was reliable. Patients who had undergone electroshock became quiet, compliant, easier to handle. They were also, according to multiple accounts, scared into submission by the experience. The threat of another session was often enough to enforce obedience. This was not treatment in any meaningful sense of the word. It was discipline administered with a machine. But the most notorious tool of all was the lobotomy. Danvers has been called the birthplace of the prefrontal lobotomy by neurology experts, a title earned not through a single dramatic moment but through the sheer volume of procedures performed within its walls. The lobotomy was first performed at Danvers in 1948. The technique had been developed years earlier, but it was popularized and evangelized by a man named Walter Freeman. Freeman was not a surgeon. He was a neurologist with a traveling practice and a conviction that bordered on obsession. He called his visits to state mental hospitals headhunting expeditions. He performed the transorbital lobotomy, which involved inserting an instrument resembling an ice pick above the eye socket, driving it into the brain with a mallet, and then sweeping it back and forth to sever neural connections. He sometimes performed the procedure without surgical masks or gloves. He did not always use anesthesia. In 1952, Freeman performed 228 lobotomies in just 2 weeks at state hospitals in West Virginia, charging $25 per operation. Over the course of his career, Freeman performed more than 3,500 lobotomies. Approximately 490 of his patients died, a mortality rate of roughly 14%. 1 in 7 people who lay down on his table did not get back up. While Freeman's specific documented activity at Danvers remains unclear in the academic literature, the procedure was used extensively at the hospital through the late 1940s and the 1950s. Visitors to the wards during this period described what they saw: lobotomy patients wandering aimlessly through the halls, staring blankly at walls, people who had been agitated, distressed, sometimes violent, reduced to something quieter, something empty. They were no longer difficult to manage. They were also no longer entirely present. The lobotomy declined after the mid-1950s, but not because of moral objections. It declined because a drug called chlorpromazine, marketed as Thorazine, arrived around 1955 and offered the same result in pill form. Thorazine did not cure mental illness. It suppressed symptoms. It made patients manageable. Medical professionals at the time called it a chemical lobotomy, and the name was more accurate than most of them probably intended. The man who oversaw the hospital through its darkest period was Dr. Clarence A. Bonner, the longest-serving superintendent, who held the position from 1927 to 1954. Bonner presided over the severe overcrowding, the 1934 poisoning, the 1938 investigation into patient deaths, and the introduction of lobotomies, insulin shock, and electroconvulsive therapy. When he retired, the hospital honored him by naming a new 100,000-square-foot medical building after him. The Bonner Medical Building, a monument to the man who ran the place during the years when patients were beaten to death, lobotomized, and restrained in straitjackets that the hospital's founders had sworn would never be used. That building would eventually be demolished too. But we will get to that. The human cost of what happened inside Danvers was not an abstraction. It was not a statistic in a government report. It had a name, a face, and a story that, against every possible odd, ended somewhere other than a numbered grave on a forgotten hillside. Marie Balter was born in 1930. Her mother was an alcoholic who abandoned her. She was adopted by an elderly couple who abused her. By the time she was 17, she had attempted suicide, and in 1947 or 1948, she was admitted to Danvers State Hospital. The doctors diagnosed her with schizophrenia. They were wrong. She actually suffered from severe anxiety and psychotic depression, conditions that could have been treated very differently. But at Danvers in the late 1940s, the distinction did not matter much. She was placed on near lethal doses of an experimental antipsychotic called stelazine. The staff, according to accounts that emerged later, placed bets on whether she would survive 2 weeks outside the institution. She did not get the chance to prove them wrong for a very long time. Marie Balter spent approximately 20 years inside Danvers from 1948 to 1968. She entered as a teenager, and by the time she was finally discharged, she was approaching 40. 20 years of her life spent inside a building that was designed to help people recover, in a system that had instead warehoused her based on a diagnosis that was incorrect. What happened next should have been impossible. After her release, Balter enrolled at North Shore Community College and earned an associate degree. She went to Salem State College, and then she was accepted at Harvard University, where she earned a master's degree. The woman that hospital staff had bet would not last 2 weeks on the outside had a degree from Harvard. She married Joseph Balter, who was himself a former patient and an accountant. And then she did something that still feels difficult to fully comprehend. She went back. Marie Balter returned to Danvers State Hospital as an employee. She served as Director of Community Affairs and as the Chief Hospital Spokeswoman. She walked to the same corridors where she had spent 20 years as a patient. But now she walked them with a title, an office, and a voice. She co-authored an autobiography called Nobody's Child in 1987 with psychologist Richard Katz. The book was adapted into a television movie starring Marlo Thomas, which aired in 1986. She founded the Balter Institute, dedicated to patient-led mental health care. She spent the rest of her career trying to change the system from within. She died in August of 1999 at the age of 68. A memorial bench sits at the Danvers State Hospital cemetery, not far from the 770 unmarked graves. Balter's story was extraordinary, but it was also singular. For every Marie Balter who fought her way out, there were hundreds of patients who never did. In 1987, a patient named Ann Houghton simply wandered out of the hospital and was found dead the next day, just 200 yards from the building, after suffering a heart attack. The resulting scrutiny revealed that the administrator overseeing the facility, William Bonds, had presided over serious security lapses, including an incident in which a female patient was raped by a male patient in a women's restroom. Bonds later came under investigation in Idaho after a patient was beaten to death at a facility he ran, with evidence that staff had tried to cover up the cause of death by listing it as pneumonia. Balter proved that patients could recover. The question was whether the institution itself ever would. By the time she died, the answer was already clear. Danvers was closing. The building that had swallowed 20 years of her life was about to be emptied for good. The forces that would eventually close Danvers State Hospital did not arrive suddenly. They gathered slowly, across decades, from multiple directions at once. The development of antipsychotic medications in the 1950s made it possible, at least in theory, to manage serious mental illness outside of an institution. Exposés of conditions inside state hospitals, including photographs and investigative reports that reached the public for the first time, generated outrage. And a philosophical shift toward community-based treatment gained traction among reformers who argued that locking people away in massive buildings was itself a form of cruelty, regardless of how well those buildings were maintained. These forces converged into what became known as the deinstitutionalization movement. The movement had a very specific political moment. On October 31, 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act. It was the last piece of legislation he would ever sign. 23 days later, he was assassinated in Dallas. Some historians believe the law was personal for Kennedy. His sister Rosemary had received a lobotomy and been institutionalized for life, a fact the family kept quiet for decades. The act authorized $150 million for the construction of 1,500 community mental health centers across the country, facilities that were supposed to replace the state hospitals and provide care in a more humane, more localized setting. The promise was enormous. The delivery was not. Only about 750 of those centers were ever built. Federal funding lasted just 3 years. The infrastructure that was supposed to catch patients when the institutions released them was never completed. It was barely started. But the institutions closed anyway. The National State Mental Hospital Census had peaked at 550, 8,922 patients in 1955. By the early 2000s, that number had dropped by over 90%. In Massachusetts, hospital populations peaked above 25,000 in the 1950s, before falling off a cliff. At Danvers, the decline was physical as well as numerical. The patient population shrank through the 1960s and the 1970s, as wards closed one by one. In 1970, the central tower, the 130-foot spire that had defined the building's silhouette since the 1870s, was removed because it had decayed beyond repair. A class action lawsuit called Brewster versus Dukakis, alleging unconstitutional conditions, resulted in a 1978 consent decree that required the discharge of higher functioning patients. By the 1980s, the population had dropped to under 200 in a building designed for 450. The administration block closed in 1989. The remaining patients were moved to the Bonner Medical Building, named after the superintendent who had overseen the lobotomies. The final decision came in February of 1991, when Governor William Weld appointed a 17-member commission to evaluate the state hospital system. The commission's finding was blunt. Approximately 47% of the Department of Mental Health budget was going to state hospitals that served only 6% of the department's consumers. Weld accepted the recommendation to close 9 mental health facilities within 3 years. On June 24, 1992, the last patients at Danvers were transferred to Tewksbury State Hospital. The doors were locked, the lights went off. The theory was that these patients would be absorbed into a community care system that would serve them better. The reality was different. An estimated 25 to 30% of America's homeless population has serious mental illness. Scholars have a term for what actually happened. They call it trans-institutionalization. Patients did not move from hospitals into community care. They moved from hospitals into the streets, into shelters, and into prisons. The system that was supposed to replace Danvers was never built. The patients were simply released into a void. They closed the doors, they turned off the lights, and then they left everything inside. Left. For 13 years, from 1992 to 2005, Danvers State Hospital sat empty. Or rather, it sat occupied by everything that had been abandoned when the last staff walked out. Empty. Preservationist John Archer, who documented the site during this period, described what he found inside. It was like the day they closed it. After the last shift, everyone put on their coats and just left everything as it was. Equipment, documents, everything. Medical records remained in filing cabinets. Patient files dating back to the 1800s sat on shelves and scattered across floors. Canceled payroll checks. Personal possessions that no one had claimed. The filmmakers who arrived in 2000 to shoot a horror movie reported finding old patient tissue and blood samples still sitting in storage rooms. Nobody had cleaned it out. Nobody had secured it. The state simply locked the doors and walked away. The building did what buildings do when humans stop maintaining them. It fell apart. Roofs collapsed. Windows shattered. Graffiti covered the walls. Vegetation crept inside, consuming the grounds and then the structures themselves. The underground tunnel system, which had connected every building on the campus since the 1870s, became a network of flooded, crumbling passages filled with debris and darkness. Tunnels. But it was outside the building, in the overgrown fields behind it, where the most disturbing discovery waited. The hospital had 2 cemeteries. Together, they contained approximately 770 graves, 677 in the main cemetery, and 93 in the Middleton Colony Cemetery. After the hospital closed, the grounds were left untended. The grass grew wild. Trees and brush swallowed the cemetery boundaries. Within a few years, you could walk right past the graves without knowing they were there. And that is exactly what happened until 1997, when a former patient named Patricia Deegan was walking her dog near the property and stumbled across them. What she found was not a proper cemetery in any recognizable sense. The graves bore no names. Each one was marked only with a numbered metal pipe driven into the ground. No headstone, no inscription, no record of who lay beneath. The policy reflected the stigma attached to mental illness. These patients had been buried anonymously, as though even in death they were something to be hidden. Deegan founded the Danvers State Memorial Committee in February 1998. Over the next 4 years, the committee painstakingly identified the names of more than 3/4 of the 770 people buried there. In 2002, 3 granite markers with bronze plaques were erected as a wall of remembrance. For the first time, the dead had names. While the committee was doing that work, Danvers was becoming something else entirely. It became one of the most famous urban exploration destinations in America. The underground tunnels drew trespassers from across the country. People came with flashlights and cameras, climbing through broken windows and prying open sealed doors to walk through wards that still had patient beds in them, corridors where paint peeled from the walls in sheets, rooms where ceiling plaster lay in heaps on rotting floors. In the 5 years before the property was finally sold, state police charged 150 people with trespassing and issued warnings to 450 more. Over 120 of those arrested were specifically identified as ghost hunters. The paranormal reputation of Danvers grew immense during this period. Visitors reported disembodied voices, apparitions, shadow figures in the tunnels, and electronic voice phenomena recordings that allegedly captured phrases like "I live here and I am warning you." The Massachusetts Paranormal Crossroads Group called the building one of the crown jewels in the paranormal history of Massachusetts. The state's Department of Capital Asset Management received more than a dozen formal seance requests in a single year. Colin Dickey, who wrote about Danvers extensively in his book Ghostland, observed something that cut closer to the truth than any ghost story. America, he wrote, sometimes piles one tragedy upon another, as if to quarantine the evil. A witch trial Judge's Hill, an asylum built on top of it, overcrowding, lobotomies, and death inside that asylum, and then 13 years of silence, decay, and darkness piled on top of all of it. Tragedy and silence, layered one on top of the other. But Danvers did not just haunt the people who trespassed inside it. It haunted an entire century of fiction. The chain that connects this building to the most famous fictional madhouse in the world starts with a reclusive writer from Providence, Rhode Island, who never quite got over his fear of the dark. H.P. Lovecraft was born in 1890 and died in 1937. Largely unknown, largely broke, and largely convinced that the universe was a hostile and incomprehensible place. During his lifetime, he created a body of horror fiction that would influence virtually every writer, filmmaker, and game designer who came after him. One of his most enduring creations was a fictional city called Arkham. Arkham first appeared in a short story called The Picture in the House, written in 1920. In a letter from 1934, Lovecraft wrote that his mental picture of Arkham was of a town something like Salem in atmosphere and style of houses. His literary executor, August Derleth, was more direct. He described Arkham as Lovecraft's own well-known, widely used place name for legend-haunted Salem. Remember, Danvers was Salem Village. The witch trials happened here. And the most imposing structure in the area, the Gothic red brick asylum on the hill, with its cascading peaked roofs, underground tunnels, and its own graveyard, was Danvers State Hospital. Lovecraft's Arkham Sanitarium appears most prominently in The Thing on the Doorstep, written in 1933 and published in 1937. Literary historians believe it was modeled directly after Danvers. The physical descriptions align, the atmosphere aligns. The sense of a place where madness and architecture have merged into something inseparable aligns as well. But the chain did not stop with Lovecraft. It jumped into comics, and from there, it entered the bloodstream of global pop culture. In 1974, a DC Comics editor named Jack C. Harris was working with writer Dennis O'Neil on Batman. Harris had an idea. He later recalled the conversation. I said, Denny, you know criminals like Two-Face and the Joker should not be just jailed. They are nuts. They should be in an insane asylum. And what better one than Arkham Asylum from the Lovecraft stories? Arkham Hospital first appeared in Batman issue 258 in October 1974. The name Arkham Asylum was formalized in Batman issue 326 in 1980 by Len Wein. In 1989, Grant Morrison and Dave McKean published the graphic novel Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, and that edition cemented the institution as central to Batman mythology. The Batman Arkham video game series, released between 2009 and 2024, collectively sold more than 32 million copies worldwide. Every one of those copies featured an asylum whose name traced back through Lovecraft to a real building on a real hill in Danvers, Massachusetts. Bob Kane and Bill Finger, who created Batman in 1939, had no connection to Danvers. The link runs exclusively through Lovecraft to Harris and O'Neil, but the result is the same. The most famous fictional madhouse in the world is an echo of a real one. In the year 2000, someone decided to make a movie inside the real thing while it was still standing. Director Brad Anderson and co-writer Stephen Gevedon wrote the script for Session 9 specifically for Danvers State Hospital. They did not adapt the location to the story, they adapted the story to the location. Filming took place in September and October of 2000, with a cast that included Peter Mullen, David Caruso, Josh Lucas, and Paul Guilfoyle. The production brought almost nothing with them. Nearly all the props were found on site. Only 3 rooms in the entire building received any additions from the crew. The decay was real. The patient files on the floor were real. The atmosphere was real. The film follows an asbestos abatement crew that slowly unravels psychologically while working inside the hospital. One crew member discovers disturbing recordings of therapy sessions with a patient who had dissociative identity disorder. The final recording reveals an alter personality named Simon, who declares, "I live in the weak and the wounded." Session 9 grossed just $1.2 million, released on only 30 screens. But it developed a devoted cult following and currently holds a 67% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. What stayed with people more than the plot were the stories the cast told afterward. David Caruso said he saw something pass his window during filming and called Danvers the scariest building in America. Peter Mullen reported hearing a voice in his head telling him to jump off the roof. The fiction endured. The building itself was about to disappear. Conversations about what to do with Danvers State Hospital started as early as 1981. The building was deteriorating. The state had no use for it. The maintenance costs were enormous and climbing. Something had to happen. On January 26, 1984, the hospital was accepted onto the National Register of Historic Places, a designation covering 40 structures on the campus. The application was prepared in part by Richard Trask, the Danvers town archivist, who understood better than almost anyone what the site represented. The listing should have offered some protection. In practice, it offered very little. After years of negotiations, a Virginia-based apartment development company called Avalon Bay Communities signed a purchase agreement with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 2003. Avalon Bay took ownership on December 14, 2005, paying $12 million for the 77-acre property. Of that purchase price, $3.2 million went to affordable housing for Department of Mental Health clients, roughly $6 million went to the state's general fund, and approximately $2 million went to the town of Danvers for education, preservation, and housing. The Danvers Preservation Fund filed an 11th-hour lawsuit in Salem Superior Court, arguing that the state and town had failed to give due attention to the historic value of the buildings. On November 8, 2005, Judge Howard Whitehead denied the injunction. Demolition could proceed. Trask's reaction was blunt. He called the decision a monumental blot in the annals of Massachusetts preservation. And then he made a prediction. 50 years from now, he said, people are going to wonder how we allowed something so magnificent to be destroyed. Demolition began in January of 2006. The contractor was Testa Corporation of Wakefield, the Kirkbride complex that had taken 4 years to build, that had employed 200 men and 60 horses, that had been constructed from Cape Ann granite and red Danvers brick and main slate and copper flashing, that had stood on Hathorne Hill for 128 years, was demolished in less than 4 months. The destruction was extensive. 6 of the 8 original Kirkbride wards were torn down. The nurses' homes were demolished. Both chapels were demolished. The Bonner Medical Building, the 100,000 square foot facility named after the superintendent who oversaw the lobotomies, was demolished. The tuberculosis cottages, the lower grounds buildings, all of it, gone. What survived was a shell. The outermost brick facade of the administration building and the G&D wards on each side were preserved. But preserved is a generous word. They were propped up while entirely new structures were built behind them. A replica tower was constructed to replace the original that had been removed in 1970 due to structural decay. The bones were kept. Everything inside them was new. And then, on April 7th, 2007, the day before Easter, a fire broke out. It was a 4-alarm blaze. It erupted at approximately 1:50 in the morning and destroyed 4 unfinished apartment buildings that were supposed to house 147 units, along with 4 construction trailers. The fire was visible from Boston, 17 miles away. Firefighters from 8 communities responded. 7 suffered minor burns. State Fire Marshal Stephen Cohn said he would not categorize the fire as suspicious. He also said that no possible cause had been eliminated. The cause was never officially determined. Many people suspected arson. The paranormal community had a different explanation. They attributed the fire to the spirits of former patients, the idea being that the dead were not willing to let their home be turned into luxury housing without a fight. Whether you believe that or not, The fire set construction back 6 to 8 months, and the fact that the cause was never established only added another layer to a site that had been accumulating layers of mystery and tragedy for over 300 years. Construction resumed. The apartments were finished. When people finally moved in, they moved into a building that sat on top of witch trial land, asylum land, cemetery land, and the ashes of an unexplained fire. The question of what it felt like to live there, and what had been erased to make that living possible, was about to become very concrete. The completed development opened in 2008 under the name Avalon Danvers, 433 luxury apartments spread across 12 buildings, constructed at a cost of $80 million. The renovated Kirkbride section, 105,000 square feet of the original structure's outer shell, now housed 61 apartments with 31 different floor plans, a leasing center, a fitness center, an indoor basketball court, and a heated pool. An additional 64 senior condominiums called Aria were developed separately, priced between $395,000 and $640,000. In June of 2014, the property was sold to DSF Group for $108.5 million. 9 times what Avalon Bay had paid for it less than a decade earlier. The complex was renamed Bradley Danvers, after Nathaniel Jeremiah Bradley, the architect who had designed the original hospital in 1873. It is now owned by UDR Incorporated. The address is 1101 Kirkbride Drive. Richard Trask, the town archivist who had fought to preserve the buildings, had a word for what the redevelopment had accomplished. He called it Disney-fied. Only a ghost image of the original structure survived, he said. A visitor to the Kirkbride Buildings blog who toured a model apartment confirmed the impression. Avalon has erased any sense of the building as a historic structure, they wrote. Inside the apartments, there was no trace of what had come before. Granite countertops where wards had been. Recessed lighting where patients had walked the halls naked. A swimming pool on grounds where people had died from lobotomies, beatings, and neglect. The cemeteries remain. They are accessible and maintained. Annual memorial ceremonies have been held since 2002, when the Wall of Remembrance was erected. The 770 graves are still there, with names now attached to most of them, thanks to Patricia Deegan and the Memorial Committee. That much at least was not erased. But the building's story raises a question that goes beyond Danvers. What happens to these places when they are no longer useful and no longer frightening enough to leave alone? Danvers was one of approximately 78 Kirkbride plan hospitals built across North America between 1848 and 1913. The first was Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey, championed by Dorothea Dix herself. Today, only 35 or 36 of those buildings remain standing, fewer than half. Their fates illustrate what Danvers could have been. The Buffalo State Hospital in New York was restored as a luxury hotel at a cost exceeding $100 million, and won a National Preservation Award in 2018. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia was purchased at auction for $1.5 million and now operates as a tourist attraction offering heritage and paranormal tours. The village at Grand Traverse Commons in Traverse City, Michigan, was converted into a thriving mixed-use development of shops, restaurants, and residences, widely considered the most successful Kirkbride adaptive reuse in the country. Danvers got apartments. It got a replica tower and a preserved facade with nothing original behind it. It got a name that honored the architect while erasing everything his building had witnessed. The building survived, in a way. Whether any trace of what happened inside it survived is a different question entirely. If you want to see how another abandoned institution tried to bury its history, that video is on screen now. Subscribe for more stories from America's forgotten places.